All right, let's dive right into this explainer and unravel one of the most famous, yet honestly profoundly misunderstood psychological mysteries in all of literary history. Now, when most of us hear Jekyll and Hyde, we probably picture, a cartoonish mad scientist or just a generic movie monster. But the original source material, Robert Louis Stevenson's iconic novella, it is so much more than just a simple horror story. It's actually this brilliantly structured detective story that slowly peels back the layers of human morality. So today, we're going to look closely at the evidence, the timelines, and the first-hand accounts to figure out what exactly happened behind the closed doors of Dr. Henry Jekyll's laboratory.
Picture this. We are dropping right into the dark, fog-choked streets of Victorian London to start our investigation. Our story kicks off with a late-night stroll where a witness, Mr. Richard Enfield, recounts this absolutely horrifying scene. It's the dead of night, right? And he watches a small, deformed-looking man and a screaming young girl running down a cross street. They collide, and instead of stopping, the man just calmly tramples right over the child's body and leaves her shrieking on the ground. It's brutal. Enfield famously describes the attacker with a chilling thought, "It wasn't like a man, it was like some damn juggernaut." The attacker is eventually caught, identifies himself as Mr. Edward Hyde, and actually pays off the girl's family to avoid a scandal. But the sheer, unexplainable hatred he inspires in literally everyone who looks at him, that sets the stage for our entire mystery.
Which brings us to part 1, the monster in the streets. Because a dark secret is definitely brewing here.
So while this violent monster is just roaming the dingy alleys of Soho unchecked, we're actually following the perspective of Mr. Gabriel John Utterson. And Utterson isn't some hotshot police inspector, he's a rugged, super pragmatic lawyer. He's a man of strict routine, cold, scanty, and dreary, yet, as the text notes, somehow lovable. He's fiercely loyal to his oldest friends and kind of has a habit of being the last reputable acquaintance of guys who are going down a bad path. But when Utterson hears Enfield's story about that trampling, it doesn't just shock him, it absolutely terrifies him. Why? Because Utterson already knows the name Edward Hyde.
Moving on to part 2, the lawyer's investigation. And guys, this is where we uncover a truly disturbing connection.
As Utterson starts pulling at the threads of this mystery, he pulls out a document kept locked in his private safe, Dr. Jekyll's will. And it is a wildly unusual, honestly suspicious document. It says that if Jekyll dies, absolutely everything goes to this monster, Edward Hyde. But even weirder, if Jekyll simply disappears or has an unexplained absence for over 3 months, Hyde gets to step right into Jekyll's shoes, completely free of any burdens or obligations. Crazy, right? Considering all this, Utterson jumps to the most logical conclusion. Edward Hyde has got to be blackmailing the good, respectable doctor for some dark sin from his past.
When we put these two men side by side, the unexplainable contrast only deepens Utterson's fear. On one hand, we have Dr. Jekyll, 50 years old, large, handsome, a wealthy guy totally celebrated for his charities and warm friendships. But on the other side is Hyde. He's young, pale, dwarfish. But here's the thing. It's not actually a physical deformity that makes people hate him so much. It's a spiritual one. Witnesses can't even quite put their finger on what's physically wrong with Hyde, but they universally feel this intense shudder in their blood whenever they're around him. Utterson realizes it's the mere radiance of a foul soul basically transfiguring its physical vessel. Now Hyde's evil doesn't just sit still, it escalates, and fast. We start with the callous trampling of the child on that black winter morning. Then, nearly a year later, in October, Hyde's violence explodes into sheer madness. He literally beats a beloved older gentleman, Sir Danvers Carew, to death in the street with a heavy cane. And get this, it's a cane that Utterson actually gifted to Jekyll years ago. Following the murder, Hyde vanishes. For a few months, Jekyll seems renewed, even happy. But by January, Jekyll abruptly locks himself away in his laboratory, refusing to see Utterson or literally anyone else. By March, things hit a fever pitch. Jekyll's servants are finding these desperate notes, begging wholesale chemists all over London to send him a specific, pure version of a drug.
That brings us to part 3, breaking down the door. Get ready for a terrifying discovery.
Okay, the suspense literally reaches a boiling point when Jekyll's terrified servants summon Utterson on a wild, freezing, incredibly windy night in March. Dr. Jekyll's loyal butler, Poole, has been listening outside the laboratory door, and he insists that the weeping, frantic creature locked inside the cabinet, pacing up and down night and day, is absolutely not his master. The voice is completely changed. He says it sounds like a rat crying out.
Poole even caught a brief glimpse of a masked figure digging wildly through crates of chemicals, telling Utterson that thing in the mask was never Dr. Jekyll. Convinced that Hyde has murdered the doctor and is now trapped inside, Utterson and Poole make the drastic decision to take an axe to the beautiful red baize door.
So they swing the axe, smash the lock, and bust into the quiet, cozy cabinet room. But instead of finding Jekyll murdered and Hyde standing victorious over the body, they find a totally baffling scene. Mr. Hyde is lying dead on the floor, twitching in the final throes of poisoning by his own hand. And he's dressed in clothes that are vastly too large for him because they're Dr. Jekyll's clothes. They search the entire premises everywhere, but there's no trace of Henry Jekyll, dead or alive. Just a series of documents left on the desk addressed right to Utterson.
Which leads us to part 4, the shocking confession. It's time to uncover the impossible truth.
To wrap our heads around this impossible truth, we have to look at a letter left by Dr. Lanyon. This is a man who literally died of sheer shock just days after witnessing Jekyll's horrifying scientific breakthrough. Jekyll mixed a highly pungent blood-red liquor with specific white crystalline salt powder. The potion would bubble, change from a dark purple to a watery green, and upon drinking it, the user would experience racking pangs, deadly nausea, and this awful grinding in the bones. It was the absolute horror of death and birth combined. But when the agony finally subsided, the physical body would literally melt and alter. Dr. Lanyon watched in screaming terror as Edward Hyde transformed right before his eyes into Dr. Henry Jekyll.
Here's the massive plot twist. Jekyll and Hyde? They were never two separate men. They were the exact same person. Before the experiments even began, Jekyll's soul was vastly dominated by his respectable Victorian persona. He was mostly good, mostly controlled, with a lifetime of effort and virtue behind him. Edward Hyde simply represented the smaller, unexercised, repressed evil inside of him. And that is exactly why Hyde was initially so small, dwarfish, and young compared to the large 50-year-old Jekyll. Hyde was just the physical embodiment of Jekyll's hidden, dark desires, finally let off the leash.
But watch how the balance of power completely flips by the end of our timeline. See, Jekyll loved the freedom of being Hyde. He could indulge his most monstrous, depraved desires with zero consequences to his reputation. But as he kept indulging this vicarious depravity, Hyde grew in stature and strength. The evil was nourished. Soon enough, Jekyll began waking up in the morning as Hyde without even taking the potion. Hyde eventually took over almost completely, rendering Jekyll completely unable to reverse the transformation without those drugs. And tragically, the original salt Jekyll used was impure. Once that specific tainted batch ran out, he could never recreate the potion, sealing his doom as Edward Hyde forever.
And that brings us to our final section, Part 5, the Duality of Man. This is where the mystery really becomes a tragic analysis.
So this final confession shifts our explainer from a thrilling whodunit to a really profound psychological dive. To understand Jekyll's motivation, we have to look at the duality of man, specifically through the lens of Victorian repression. Jekyll felt this immense, crushing pressure to maintain his high societal status. It forced him to hide his natural, maybe less dignified pleasures with a morbid sense of shame. Jekyll's potion wasn't diabolical or divine on its own. It simply shook the doors of his disposition. It stripped away his conscience and his societal restraints, separating the two natures that contended in his mind. That way, he could be completely respectable by day and completely uninhibited by night.
This brings us to maybe the most powerful realization in the entire text. Jekyll writes, "It was the curse of mankind that these incongruous faggots were thus bound together, that in the agonized womb of consciousness, these polar twins should be continuously struggling." He actually thought he was curing the human condition by separating good and evil. But he realized way too late that attempting to cast off the burden of moral responsibility doesn't free you. Not at all. It only returns that burden with an awful, totally unmanageable pressure. By letting his evil out of its cage, he gave it the strength to consume him entirely.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I've got to ask you this. If you possessed a potion to separate your darkest, most primitive desires from your daily life, with absolutely no consequences to your reputation, would you drink it? It's so easy for us to judge Jekyll, but Stevenson's masterpiece forces us to look right in the mirror. How much of our own identity is just a carefully maintained, socially acceptable mask? And what would happen if our own inner Hyde was finally handed the keys to the castle? It's a terrifying thought for sure, and it's exactly why this story continues to haunt us over a century later.